I'll be discussing with you the paper that I have written with the George on uh, this paper outlines a different business model uh, for banks in India. This is not really a radical change from what is being done, but just a change in the reformulation of the activities that banks already do. Uh, and that's what we're going to discuss broadly today. So the presentation will follow the following structure. First, I'll be, before jumping into the risk aggregator bank model, I would first situate it in the framework that we have envisioned, which is the origination, transmission, aggregation framework for the financial system, and how risk aggregators, the role the risk aggregators plays in that system. Then I'll be talking about the typology of the risk aggregator bank, basically describing about the functions that an RAB risk aggregator bank would do. Then I would be detailing the need for RAB type institutions in India, some efficiency gains from having RAB type entities. Then I'd be moving on to some of the bottlenecks which hinder the development of RAB like institutions in India along institutional, infrastructure, and regulatory lines. Finally, I'll be concluding with some recent regulatory developments which are pertinent to some of the topics that we have discussed in the paper. So before I jump into what is a risk aggregator bank and what it does and how it's going to help, I would first take a step back and I would like to give you a brief overview of the framework for financial system that we have thought of in BARA and which informs most of our thinking, research, and advocacy. So this is what we call as a origination, transmission, and aggregation framework. The basic premise here is that we believe that all entities in the financial system perform three broad functions: risk origination, risk transmission, and risk aggregation. To elaborate on them, risk origination, very broadly, is the design and delivery of financial services in a smooth and convenient manner. And this typically would include entity performing activities like designing products for customers, which take into account moral hazard and adverse selection issues, establishing the identity of the customer, which is mostly our KYC processes, not only during customer acquisition, but also on an ongoing basis, assessment and underwriting of risk. So given that we have these entities have the interface with the customers and they get the most information about the customers, they would be best placed to sort of assess and underwrite the risk of the customers, and of course product servicing. So this is typically what we think of as the activities which are being done by originators. It is one class of entities. Other is risk transmission. It is the movement of risk from one entity to another in return for market determined rate. Right? So in a well-functioning financial system, risk moves in an orderly manner from those originating it to those who are best placed to manage it. This, in our view, improves the overall capability of the system to manage risk, right? And risk transmission, function of risk transmission typically includes activities like identifying and understanding the risks that need to be transferred, accurately measuring and pricing risks, and developing appropriate instruments for transferring such risk. Right? So your capital markets, like your bond markets, derivative markets, so they typically perform this function in a financial system. And finally, we have risk aggregation. So over here, very simply, risk aggregation is just accumulation of the risks that are being originated in a financial system and efficiently managing them. So typically, and this is what we'll be, I'll be discussing about in greater detail in today's presentation, but in a banking context. Typically, the activities which come under the risk aggregation would include having adequate risk governance and audit mechanism, risk-based pricing, employing risk management techniques like transferring of risk and hedging, ensuring risk diversification, which is one more method of risk management, and most importantly, allocating capital appropriate to the risks that you have taken on, chosen to take on. So this is very broadly how we conceptualize a financial system and categorize the various participants in the financial system according to these functions that I have outlined. It is in this framework in which we are talking about a risk aggregator bank. So basically, we are trying to adopt this framework in the specific instance of Indian banking system and trying to find out how would such a risk aggregator bank look like and function in India. So if you see the current scenario, many entities, banks, insurers, pension funds, mutual funds, they currently perform all of these functions in varying degrees. So for instance, banks have their sales and the loan officers go out in the field. They take the identity documents from the customers, they take customer details, and they originate the risk, the credit risk. In the case of banking, the origination is in the form of credit risk. So I give a loan to a customer, I give a loan to a farmer, for instance. So insurers and banks, again, they internally price these risks through transfer pricing mechanisms, and they hold these loans to maturity, right? So typically, banks, they do not sell these loans, they do not try to hedge them. And there are some risk management, so most banks do follow some risk management methods. But for the most part, if you can see from the activities that I had described previously, they perform all three sort of activities. And this is true for insurers and also the other pension mutual funds which operate in the non-banking space. So here again, the main type of risk originated by each entity differs. So for banks, they mainly involve themselves in credit risk. They try to assess the credit risk. They try to try to price this in by accurately assessing the credit risk and then putting a credit risk premium, which is your interest rate, which is the interest rate, final interest rate charged to the borrower, and they try to manage this. Life insurers and pension funds face what we call as mortality risk. And mutual funds face market risk. So the general framework that I had described previously would apply across financial functions like credit, insurance, investments, and so on. So I'm just giving you a general overview of how this framework that we have thought of works. But I'll be sort of focusing my view on the banking system next, right? So typically we find in the banking sector currently that the role of banks as aggregators seem only incidental to the primary role of originators. So we see a lot of banks talking about developing products which are customer oriented, which are easily accessible to the customer, which are suitable to the customer, which is all very important as for the function as originators. But typically we don't see as much emphasis on banks talking about their risk management philosophies or their risk management frameworks, how they aggregate and manage this risk. So we would like to sort of shift this focus on that part today. So what is the risk aggregator bank? What does it do? Simply put, risk aggregator banks will be scheduled commercial banks and will perform the same functions as a typical scheduled commercial bank on the liability side. So they will be taking deposits, which are deposits, current account, savings account, everything. So the business on the liability side will resemble exactly as what a normal bank, universal bank has. Now, on the asset side, risk aggregator banks will acquire and or invest in a variety of credit and manage them like a portfolio. And typically, while building their asset books, so risk aggregator banks can use a variety of sort of tools and methods to do that. So they could do direct assignment purchases from other banks and other NBFCs. They can invest in BTCs. They can purchase bonds, subscribe bonds of corporates in the capital market, and also they can gain such exposure to off-balance sheet guarantees and other off-balance sheet arrangements. So the main idea over here is that these banks would not originate credit risk directly, but purchase them from originators. So the main idea is that we are trying to make a more clear distinction between the functions of origination and the functions of aggregation, which currently all the banks do together. So we are trying to make this distinction more stark and have an entity which we call the risk aggregator bank do only origination and not do only aggregation and not origination. So in doing this, I just want to put out the caveat that this is a very stylized version of bank. We are not really considering the real world economic business level concerns or complexities that surface in the real world. So to that extent, yes, I'm sure I believe there are many practitioners in the webinar, and I'm sure they'll have a lot of questions. So I'll just request you to keep this caveat in mind. This is a very stylized and idealized version of a bank that you're thinking about. And yes, we do need to look out, think about these sort of real world impediments that would pop up, especially on the business and commercial side. But for the purposes of this paper, so we would like you to sort of keep this in mind. Next, I'd like to elaborate on why we need such RAB type institutions. I mean, we already have banks, they take deposits from savers and then they give out loans. So it's all working well, right? So what's the point? So our view is that India is a bank-dominated economy, clearly, with more than 90% of the credit to the private real sector is coming from banks. Of late, there has been a regulatory push from both RBI and SEBI to sort of make corporates raise more money in the capital markets, but that still has started like borne fruit yet. But yes, there's definitely a regulatory push in that end. So when we compare ourselves, the credit GDP ratio, which is a form of, which is a metric for credit of an economy. When we compare this to the other emerging market economies, we find that India's bank credit to private non-financial sector is among the lowest. So and these are not like very small nations, China, South Africa, Malaysia. So economies comparable to our stage of development and also economy, and also the development of the financial sector. So we find, so that is comparison amongst our peers. But then when we compare the size of the banking sector with the needs of our India's real economy, we find that the bank credit is inadequate. As an exercise, what we did was we took the top 10 largest banks in India and then analyzed how much they could credit they could give to the corporates in India. So RBI has a large exposures framework which limits banks' exposures to a single counterparty to a maximum of 25% of its Tier 1 capital. So we took this as our anchor and constraint, and given that all banks follow this constraint, we compare the cumulative Tier 1 capital of India's top 10 banks against the domestic currency bank borrowings from the top 10 corporates according to the balance sheet. So in this analysis, we found that the top 10 banks in India were able to cover only the borrowings, the domestic currency borrowings of only the top 5 corporates. Having said that, we also acknowledge that banks banks can have multiple such exposures. It's not necessarily the case that it can have only one exposure, one single party exposure, which is 20% of a tier one capital. You can have multiple such exposures. However, the number of such exposures again constrained by both uh, capital regulations and banks' internal policies. They don't want to have very concentrated exposures to corporate. So to that extent, this analysis holds good in that we find that the bank credit as compared to the needs of the real sector does seem to sort of fall short. And over here in this analysis, again, we have not considered, we assume that the banks have not invested in any of the corporate papers of these of these corporates, right? So at a system level, when we look at the profitability uh, of these banks, we find that in India, banks have a return on assets of less than 0%. Right? In comparison, banks, when we look at the top 100 banks with return of assets, in other jurisdictions, they have return of assets between 0 and 2%. Basically, a positive return on assets. Right? So this seems to indicate that banks in India at a system level don't seem to be running very profitably. So they seem to be doing something that's making them lose value uh, uh, in their business. And in contrast, we find that NBFCs have relatively higher return on assets. Again, I would caveat this while saying that yes, currently NBFCs ROA and NPA metrics might seem better than banks, but we acknowledge that they have their own set of problems, and most of which was brought recently to light after the IL&FS and DHFL crisis. And we also acknowledge that AQR, which was done for banks, post which there was an increase in NPA and also drop in ROA. So if this was done for NBFCs, it could be the case that NBFCs also show a similar decline in their ROA and increase in NPA. However, as of date, there is no evidence of systematic underreporting of NPAs or evergreen of bad loans among the NBFCs. So, to that extent,
Madhu, you have 10 minutes.
Sorry?
You have 10 minutes more for your presentation.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so to that extent, we still believe that NBFCs are faring slightly better, at least, than banks at a system level in India. So the high NPAs on the asset side among the banks, even though they are being high NPAs and that's eroding the capital, for a variety of reasons, this has not driven away the depositors of the bank. So depositors have not taken away money from the bank, thinking that, oh, my bank is doing losses. One reason for this is that more than 60% of the banking system is being dominated by PSBs. So depositors know that these PSBs have an implicit government guarantee. So no matter what happens, our money is safe. Okay. Having said that, one approach that RBI also used to protect these deposits was to impose prompt corrective action on poorly performing banks. And this typically meant that there were severe restrictions on the lending ability of these banks. So RBI, taking cognizance of the fact that these banks were not able to do credit assessment and lending properly, they sort of cut off or severely restricted their lending. And this is also what is known as typically narrow banking, where banks taking the deposits from the customers instead of on lending it, they invest in government securities, right? Now, the problem with this sort of approach is that this severely restricts the amount of credit that flows to the economy, especially the private real sector, right? And that would also hamper the development and the growth of the economy. And this brings us to sort of the proximal uh, sort of reason for why we came up with this paper. So at the start, I mentioned that okay, we have a OTA framework, and in this OTA framework is where we want to situate the risk aggregator bank. Having said that, we also thought that this risk aggregator bank can, in some sense, strike a balance between completely discretionary lending, which seems to have clearly eroded the net worth of many banks, and it doesn't seem to be working. And which is at the one end. On the other end is the narrow banking, which RBI resorts to um, contain contain the poorly performing banks. So in that sense, we believe that transforming a normal bank during their operation with their origination, transmission, aggregation operations to a risk aggregator bank where the asset side is managed more like a portfolio would strike a balance between these two extremes. So, what are the sort of gains from such a entity? So, there are two that come to mind. One is a sharper focus on reliance on core competencies. Like I mentioned, we are disaggregating these entities based on the kind of activities they do. And by focusing on a specific set of activities, these entities can build on their core competencies and enhance their expertise on these activities and uh, use it to their advantage. So originators can focus on building their expertise in customer acquisition, underwriting risk, product servicing, and aggregators can just focus on effective management of risk accumulated on the balance sheet. So instead of the current scenario where every entity is doing a bit of everything, you can have entities which do these specific activities uh, in a very efficient and effective manner. So there are also some diversification benefits that can accrue. So aggregating risks from a variety of geographies and sectors and risk profiles would it could reduce overall risk in the portfolio. Also, while there's no explicit diversification benefit offered by RBI in the Basel framework, uh, there are some IRB models, the internal risk-based models, do take into account some of these benefits. And also, even among the regulated retail portfolio, RBI does allow very granular portfolio. So there are regulations where if an individual loan amount in a asset in a asset portfolio is lower than the threshold, those portfolios get capital relief. So RBI, in some sense, acknowledges that this sort of granularity, which is again a proxy for diversification, can act as uh, uh, can, act, can act as a substitute for capital relief. So, having explained what is the RAB bank, why do we need the RAB bank, and how it can function. So, now I'm coming to the what are the main bottlenecks that hinder the development of such institutions. So, I'll start with some of the institutional changes that are required uh, uh, to, to enable the functioning and development of these banks. Right? Currently, yes, banks have elaborate risk management systems and capabilities, but the RIB institution, given that it is going to focus only on the aggregation function, they would require a sort of a different set of uh, risk management methods in capabilities. So one is risk governance and audit. And when we talk about risk governance and audit, what we mean is, see, one of the critical features of an RAB is that there's of the RAB model is there's alignment between the interests of the originators and the interest and the risk appetite of the originators and the RAB bank. Right. So one way to accomplish this is that a risk aggregator bank uh, uh, enters has a risk governance and audit framework with all the originators with which it has a strategic partnership, so that it has a greater oversight on the credit assessment and the audit mechanism, and that gives it comfort that the kind of risk that's being originated by these originators is in line with our own business strategy. The other point is using risk-based pricing to ensure that while purchasing these risks from the originators, so this is done at the right cost. So these typically can be done using tools like match fund transfer pricing, activity-based costing, and risk-adjusted performance measurement. So these can be used to price and risk at the time of purchase. The other is risk monitoring, having excellent MIS systems which accurately and at real time provide you with right risk information. And RIBs, since they manage the portfolios since they are going to have a portfolio approach to managing the credit risk, they should be able to seamlessly employ risk transfer and hedging mechanisms with little or no transaction costs, so that they'll be effectively able to manage the risks that they have taken on. And finally, they also need to ensure that there's a board approved policy on the risk diversification strategies that they're going to employ. And they can also measure the diversification, the level of diversification using metrics like Hirschman Herfindahl index and so on. Something on the institutional side. So, like I mentioned, the risk aggregator is situated not in a vacuum, but in the overall OTA framework. So, it's like how you have aggregators, you need to have originators supplying a reliable pipeline of high quality assets. When we mention high quality over here, we do not necessarily mean assets with low risk. We just mean that originators who have accurately priced in the risk of the assets that they originate. So over here, we typically see NBFCs and small banks getting into this role of originators, while scheduled commercial banks, and when I say small banks, I do not necessarily mean small finance banks, but it could even be small universal banks. So while scheduled commercial banks have detailed guidelines on the pricing and risk management given by RBI, NBFCs do not have such specific guidelines on pricing, and only recently they received guidelines on risk management. So, for instance, last year, NBFCs, RBI released guidelines on liquidity risk management for NBFCs. So there is a need for more consistent regulatory treatment in the area among banks and NBFCs on areas of risk management and pricing. One other infrastructural point that we come across is that knowing the loan bond distinction. Right? So over here, the direct purchase of loans and given that the RAB is not going to originate the loans themselves, so direct purchase of loans plays an important part in the building and development of the asset book of the RAB. And the liquidity of loans make them difficult to trade, right? So one contributing factor when we spoke to practitioners what we found was that is that the differences in the loan documentation make this add to this illiquidity or add to the inability to trade. So currently, the MCA does have a division trust deed, but then that division trust deed is not comprehensive enough. It does not cover all the various covenants and dimensions of a loan contract. So to enable the greater tradability of the loans, standardized debenture trust deed (TTD) templates can be developed by RBI or FIMDA, and this could improve potentially it could reduce the loan bond distinction and help improve the liquidity of loan sale and purchase. Another important point is that the securitization market should play a pivotal role in the functioning of the RIBs, and it is necessary that the primary and secondary securitization markets in India are allowed to grow and develop. Currently, the market is opaque, fragmented, and liquid. In fact, I don't think there is a secondary securitization market in India. So, in this, we think that there is a role for government to step in and act as a sort of market maker or to enable the development of this market. And government can do this through the DFIs like SIDBI or Mudra or NABARD. So, the specific activities that the government can take in developing this market could include providing credit enhancements in the form of second loss default guarantees to securitization transactions, providing credit enhancements to pooled bond issuance, or even investing in junior tranches. So coming in as investors with junior tranches to give credit compared to other investors in senior tranches. So the government can, in this way, provide can play a major role in improving the primary and secondary securitization market. So we also touch upon the HCC framework outlined by Basel that we think will enable greater bank participation. And again, most importantly, given that securitization itself plays a pivotal role in the functioning of RAB, this means that the credit rating agencies also play an integral role in ensuring that these transactions are rated accurately and fairly. And again, recent developments have shown that credit rating agencies are also not above question, and we have outlined certain measures that we think, some reform measures that we think may be to strengthen the credit rating agency regulations. Finally, we come to the regulatory bottlenecks that sort of hinder the development of this market. One is, because of PSL targets, we know that banks have to necessarily have an exposure to the agriculture market, and this indirectly leaves them to exposed to commodity prices. But according to the RBI Act, banks cannot take any position in the commodity market. So we think that it is very important that every available risk management strategy and tool is available to RBI, to the risk aggregator bank to manage the risk. And one of that is allowing banks to take positions in the commodity market. And this is not something new. There are a couple of other committees, RBI working groups, have in fact recommended the same. One is the RBI working group on warehouse reserves instituted in 2005. The other is RBI working group on hedging of commodity markets in overseas, hedging of commodity risk in overseas markets, which was instituted in 2017. And both these committees have specifically recommended that RBI allow banks to take positions in commodity markets in a restricted way. This is not to allow banks to take highly speculative positions and again further erode their capital. But the point is, this can be done in a very calibrated manner with regulatory prescription. And finally, we come to the restrictions that banks have on the securities that they hold in their investment book. So currently, there are several restrictions that banks have in holding securities in the investment book, particularly in the held to maturity category. Currently, very few non-SLR instruments can be held in the held to maturity category. Given that banks could invest in BTCs with an intent to holding them to maturity, and also the fact that there is currently no secondary market to accurately for the valuation of these securities. The RBI should consider removing restrictions on holding BTCs to HTM category and allow banks to hold them in the HTM category declared based on declared intent. And this was also one of the recommendations of the Housing Finance Securitization Committee chaired by Dr. Harshvardhan. So to conclude, I'll just give an overview of some of the recent regulatory developments that have bearing on this paper. So one is, in the paper we had mentioned that RBI needs to provide clarification on the significant risk transfer aspect in Ind AS. So RBI has in fact come out with this clarification. So this happened a month before the paper actually released. So apologies for our oversight. So RBI has in fact clarified to NBFCs that even if there is no significant risk transfer under Ind AS, these assets the capital charge would be calculated only according to the exposure that the NBFC takes, and not according to the significant risk transfer of under NDFs. Second important related development is the releasing of the draft guidelines on securitization of standard assets by RBI. We think is a very positive move forward for two reasons. One, overall, we think the intent of the guidelines has been to set up enabling regulations which would develop and expand the primary and secondary securitization market. One. Secondly, the draft guideline explicitly mentioned the standardized, transparent, and comparable securitization as a securitization framework for capital charges, calculation of capital charges by banks. And this is also something that we have recommended in our paper, and this we think is a positive step forward by the regulator. And because this is just the draft guidelines, it's not the final guidelines, but we still think this is a step in the positive direction. So that's it from my side. Okay, I'm sorry, I have overshot my limit, but I think I'll be taking the questions from now. So Avinash Prakash has two questions. One is, how would a risk aggregator bank impact the liability side of the bank in terms of getting the reach through the brick and mortar branch network for retail deposits? Would it impact the viability of opening branches in remote rural areas? Excellent question, Avinash. So when Deepthi and I had actually worked on this paper, we had this very same question. And to be frank with you, we don't yet have an answer. This is why I mentioned at the start that I would like to add a caveat that we have not completely considered many of the real world complexities like you have correctly mentioned. So I'm talking about, I mentioned that liability side will be the same as the bank, but then I'm not going to originate in my branches. So what am I going to do with my branch and the branch network? That's a very good question. And I'm sorry, but frankly, you don't have an answer, but we'll be looking into it. What are your thoughts on the incentive alignment and skin in the game for originators? Do you only as front-end sales team, or would a broader role include accountability for collection and asset quality work better? Excellent question. Yes, incentive alignment is extremely important in the RAB model, which is why we mentioned that RAB needs to institute a risk governance and audit mechanism with all the originators with which it deals with, so that there is the risk aggregator bank can have a fair and ongoing assessment of the credit assessment processes, the risk management processes of the originators from whom it takes the assets. Also, if you see the securitization guidelines, the MRR, the minimum retention requirement, and the minimum holding period, and the first loss default guarantee provided by the originators, so they ensure that there is adequate skin in the game for originators. So these two are, I think, very important components in ensuring the incentive alignment and the skin in the game function for the originators. So I hope that answers your question. So anybody else has any more questions? I'd like to take. Anybody else has any more questions? We have a couple of minutes more. I'll be happy to take them.
Should I come in here, Madhu, and maybe ask my
own please.
First off, thank you for an excellent presentation, and compliments to you and to Deepthi for a very well written paper. A lot of hard work has gone in, and it's clearly visible. Just to clarify your presentation itself,
yes,
on the regulatory requirements, given the recent draft guidelines, etc., would it be fair to say that a lot of the recommendations you've made on the regulatory front are now being taken care of? or are there still gaps that you envisage?
Yes, majority have been taken care of, I think. I mean, assuming these draft guidelines do become final guidelines. So a couple of recommendations regarding the allowing banks to participate in the commodity markets and also removing restrictions on the HTM category. Again, we are reiterating Dr. Harshvardhan's committee recommendations. So I think these two would probably need to be taken care of.
Great. So that was just a clarification. Now I'm going to ask some really dumb questions. I was hoping that dumb questions would come before I came with my comments, but since that's what happened, let me start. The first thing that struck me, Madhu, when I read this paper, and I guess I'm biased by my foreign bank hat. This struck me as being an originate to distribute model, where a whole bunch of entities will be there in the hinterland, originating assets with the idea that they can sell this down to your RAB, to your risk aggregator bank eventually.
Yes.
Is that a comfortable proposition for you? You think this thing, I know you've said there has to be a risk audit and people have to be comfortable and all of that.
Yes.
But do you see this actually, from a regulatory perspective, do you think that will be comfortable? And from a market infrastructure perspective, do you think that works?
The originate to distribute model, yes, was one of the main reasons for the 2008 crisis. But having said that, I think one of the main problems in the originate to distribute model is that, like you mentioned, there's no skin in the game. So there was no way to ensure that these originators were not just passing on, they're not acting as pass-throughs, like bank correspondents, but actually applying their mind, using their underwriting and credit assessment processes to arrive at to originate these assets and also arrive at the correct interest rate and credit risk premiums. So if we can ensure that, I personally don't think that we need to fear this originate to distribute model too much.
Fair enough. So if I understand the nub of your paper,
yes,
essentially the large banks which have capital are not doing enough financial inclusion. The broader NBFCs which have reached inside the hinterland and are doing a lot of finance, whether it's MFIs, whether it's microfinancing, whether it's small retail financing, those are the guys who are doing it and they don't have enough capital or they don't have enough risk appetite or capital. What we're trying to do is to find a bridge between the two.
Yes, broadly, yes.
Where the MFIs can originate and then give it to the guys who have the capital. Is that broadly?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, very broadly.
Here is the next dumb question. Why is it that the large banks and large institutions which have capital, why don't they do what the NBFCs are doing? What is preventing them from doing the full-fledged inclusion as well? Yeah,
excellent question. So currently, yes, if you see even a large bank like SBI, so they have their bank branches in all the districts in India. So having had these brick and mortar branches in the hinterlands and in all districts of India, we believe that they're still not able to reach the level of financial inclusion that they can. Right? And one reason is that the large entities are hampered by their sort of process and bureaucratic nature themselves. So a lot of decision making is centralized, and the branch which is closest to the customers, which has more information about the local economy, about the customer, so those inputs are sort of lost. Now NBFCs, the small NBFCs like you mentioned, which are in these hinterland, which have more closer knowledge of the customers, we believe that they are best placed to do this risk assessment, and we believe that this is their core competency and this is what they should be focusing on. But instead, they are also forced to have capital, forced to open branches. Because if I'm an NBFC concentrate only in Chennai, and if like in 2015 when we had the Chennai floods, that would destroy my entire portfolio. So I need to diversify, which means that I need to go to other geographies and set up branches. And that might not be possible, or I might not even want that. Whereas SBI or ICICI, which already has like you mentioned, a lot of capital and has an all-India presence and also has the expertise for entering into, using the markets, like I mentioned, commodity market, the CDS market, and they have the capability to do this or employ these risk management tools. We think that they are better placed to do that instead of having them also follow the same strategy of opening your branches everywhere, mandating that everybody needs to have certain portion of their banking book in certain sectors, so on and so forth. So we think that this sort of a OTA framework allows people to have greater freedom in concentrating what they can do best, and that's what we're trying to do.
Okay, great. Yeah. No, a good answer. Thank you. The last question from me, in terms of international experience, on multiple angles. One is there a international experience particularly in emerging markets of what you're describing for financial inclusion, risk aggregator kind of model? Is there any precedent like this? Second, you talked about loan markets and bond markets and removing the distinctions and so on and so forth. What is the international experience, again, particularly in emerging markets, around secondary markets and loans developing better, let's say, compared to an Indian context? Third is, you talked about the investor or regulator pays model for credit rating agencies. The question of conflict of interest, etc. How has that worked internationally? Do we have examples of this model working? And is it kind of okay. I have one more, but I'll go one by one. So why don't you start with this particular model?
Okay.
Of what you suggested?
So you have asked 3 questions, and I think all of them pertain to the international comparisons on existence of any aggregated type institutions in other jurisdictions and how they have performed. B is your sorry, can you just repeat B?
So start with
the
that.
Loan bond distinction.
That's right.
Loan bond distinction.
Secondary market and loans.
Secondary market and loans, how they have developed in other emerging markets, in particular emerging markets. And the third is your regulator-based model.
Investor-based model.
Investor-based model, and it's on how they have developed in those jurisdictions. So we did a very limited sort of comparison with other jurisdictions, but with regard to the first point, we could not find any sort of entity which you can classify exactly as a risk aggregator. So they have a liability side in which they resemble a bank, but then on the asset side, they resemble a portfolio of managing a portfolio of credit risk. So if you look at the asset side, a debt mutual fund would probably fit the bill. Right? So they also buy bonds, invest in BTCs. They can't buy loans, but then they can do the other sort of actions, and then they can be said to be resemble the RIB in asset side. But then on the whole, we were not in a limited search. We were not able to find an entity like that. So the loan bond distinction, again, we did not do very deep analysis on secondary market of emerging market economies and see that whether this is actually a very real impediment or this is something very specific to India, or probably it's not an impediment at all. Probably there's something or some greater impediment. With regarding the regulator-based model, we are not sure if there are any existing successful models in other. Sorry.
Okay, no worries. Thanks, Madhu. So look, we have 8 minutes left. So in case there are any other questions from anybody, if you can pop them right now to Madhu. Yeah. Otherwise, I'll just go ahead with my comments. Please feel free to type in the questions. As then when they come in, we'll pick it up and Madhu can
sure.
As well. So again, once again, Madhu, excellent paper. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Was good reading through it. I'll tell you the things which struck me and the reason why I kind of like the paper. One, as I mentioned, I think you hit the nub of the problem. The fact is the people who have the capital aren't there doing enough of inclusion. And the guys who are trying to do a lot of inclusion don't have enough capital. I think that bridge is important to build. One of the bridges that you suggested is, getting this securitization / risk aggregator model done so that assets can be transferred from the originators to the aggregator, which is a great way. I'm also wondering if it's possible. When I speak to bankers, for instance, there's a lot of besides the fact that brick and mortar on the ground, etc., the points that you mentioned, the fact that there is lack of trust, and the fact is there is lack of can I get the money back? Is this person really, even if it's a small person, how do I ensure this that the money is willingness and ability to pay is there? I think a lot of it is getting sorted out by things like formalization and digitization, and databases being available, credit databases being available, etc. And therefore, to the extent that digitization proceeds, I think this larger banks getting involved in financial inclusion will improve. Aadhaar linkage, for instance, making databases available to potential lenders in a more cleaner way. All that will probably help. But it's a great model overall. In a sense, I saw your paper as a big push towards developing markets for asset transfers from one entity to the other. Including Dr. Harshvardhan's report, etc. I think a lot of those, there's a lot of overlap with that, which I completely endorse. I thought the point you made about the need for banks to be allowed in commodities market is an excellent point. And I wish more people made this point. It reminded me of this old Basel III credit value adjustment, where international banks, not to the full extent, but in international banks, risk managers do try to convert credit risk into market risk. Effectively, if you have lent money, as you said, to let's say a cotton producer or a sugar producer, one way to actually hedge against that credit risk is to short cotton or to short sugar. So that flexibility of having that tool available, I think, is an extremely important one, and I'm glad you picked this up. I also liked your idea of one platform where all rating agencies' ratings can be made available in one shot, rather than only ones that have been accepted.
This is actually already placed in ESMA. So actually ESMA has some form of this.
I think
Bindu has some question. I think.
Please go ahead.
Yeah. So one perception issue that this model faces is lazy banking. So if you don't originate the loan yourself, so what exactly are you doing, right? So an acknowledgement of the need for specialists is somehow missing. So Bindu wants to know if, Professor, you have a thought on how to address this.
Yeah, so this is something, Bindu, which bothers me as well, to be honest, and that's the reason I asked Madhu that question about this originate to distribute model. The moment, and I as a sinful foreign banker, I've gone through this. The moment you can sell down something, even after 6 months of seasoning or whatever, the thoroughness which goes into a process can get diluted, and therefore it is a problem. In fact, just on that, Bindu, one of the issues which again Madhu's identified in his paper is that there is a lot of risk capacity which is wasted when we have these PCA banks. The fact is a bank which is weak and therefore it is not able to lend, etc. The depositors also would pull out money. But in India, if you have a public sector PCA bank, nobody pulls out money. In fact, my mother banks entirely with a erstwhile PCA bank, and she refuses to move money out of that. So what happens then is they can't do anything with the deposits which are lying with them. They can only deploy them in very, very safe assets. And what was potentially a huge amount of risk transformation which could have happened doesn't happen. Instead, you have people who are starved of capital. I guess that's the whole point which Madhu's trying to make. But it is a definite risk. Personally, I would much prefer a situation where a large bank actually goes into the field of financial inclusion with commercial considerations. To Madhu's point that you have to have a trust audit of some kind, risk audit of some kind, to ensure that you lay the standards, that you convey that to the people who are originating for you, and then you monitor it. A part of my mind says you might as well go the whole hog and do the whole thing yourself, which is have the brick and mortar on the ground, ensure that the risk the risk monitoring happens. The points that Madhu made about centralization and top down, etc., is perfectly valid. But again, to the earlier point, if we get more reliable credit monitoring systems, including big data, including GST, including e-labels, including TREDS, all of that put together, including Aadhaar linkages for individual microfinance lending, etc., maybe that problem will solve itself. Which is the big guys themselves delving inside into the small hinterland. But that still doesn't take away the need for this paper. The fact that you still need risk transformation to come through. So it's quite possible that potentially the people who do this very well, which is originating assets for MFI, for financial inclusion purposes, might still be short of capital, which means the need for them to transfer that risk into others, I think, is still very, very well taken. So yes, I would be much more comfortable if the banks did it themselves. But I think the point that the paper makes is absolutely valid. You still need risk transformation to happen and come through. Exactly 1 minute to go, so I'll quickly stop here, Madhu, in the interest of time. A couple of suggestions from my end. One is that, in fact, two suggestions I've already made in terms of weak banks. I think we have to find a way in which we remove this clog of deposits getting stuck up with weak banks. That's clearly potential risk, raw material, which is getting completely wasted. And I think that's unfortunately, FRDI is making no progress, but something has to be found for that particular point. The second point is, I think formalization and digitization will go a long way in helping both direct access for the large banks or the large NBFCs, as well as for securitization. Once you have databases to corroborate the quality of the asset portfolio that's being pooled, I think the securitization can happen very well. The third thing I'll quickly add, and you mentioned this in credit derivatives. One of the points you mentioned there, I think, was that there was something about banks on what they should be allowed for them to do credit derivatives. There's also a requirement that it's a very funny situation. Mutual funds, insurance companies, pension funds cannot write protection. Here is the problem with the CDS market. The CDS market only has buyers. By definition, the way RBI has defined that market, users can only buy protection. Now, how can you have a market which has only buyers allowed in that market? I mean, which market operates that way? So anyway, so here is the beautiful way in which sellers can be allowed. A mutual fund which is allowed to buy a corporate bond can mimic a corporate bond by buying a government bond and selling protection through a CDS. It's exactly the same, through a synthetic mechanism, of course. Of course, it's got market risk and all of that, and liquidity risk and all of that. But nevertheless, it can be co-opted. I think along with all of that you're mentioning of, securitization markets, which I think you've covered extremely well, on CDSs particularly, and this requires IRDA, this requires SEBI, this requires a whole bunch of guys to come in. I think the need for allowing real money players to also sell protection, I think, is extremely important for that market to develop. Again, in the interest of time, I'll stop here. There are a few more minor points, Madhu, which I'll discuss with you and Deepti separately.
Sure.
And in fact, I have a few more, even more dumber questions, which I'll not embarrass myself on this call. But again, superb paper, great presentation. I think it's a fantastic concept. I'm glad to see the regulators are already taking note and doing some things. Hopefully, the other things which remain, we'll push through all of us collectively. But good concept, good ideas, and lots of fodder for actually thought out here. So thank you again for a great presentation.
Thank you for your kind comments, Professor Narayan. Thank you everyone for patiently hearing me out and Professor Narayan and all this while. I hope this was relevant and useful for all of you. So please reach out to me or Deepti in case you have any more comments, criticisms, questions regarding the paper, and I'm glad to talk them out. Thank you. Thank you everyone.
Thank you everybody, and have a great evening.